It is a good morning again in Kampala, and I welcome you to this episode of the Pan-African Friday, a program that comes to you all the way from the Nile Avenue in Kampala from UBC. We have, for the last 1 week, been, I think, doing many things as people, as a continent, as humans. And today we are going to look at some of the issues that definitely have happened on the African continent and issues that concern us as the people of the continent of Africa. I'm not alone in the studio as usual. I'm joined by the usual group, but also today we are joined by Ndugu Cheyune. Apparently, Ndugu Cheyune is one of the serving RDCs of this Republic of Uganda. But besides that, I have Ndugu Rugarama, and also have the only lady in the house, Takali, who will be talking to you about many things. Of course, today we're not talking about women and men issues, but we're looking at other issues that concern us as humanity. Today we'll be looking at issues of technology on the African continent, excuse me, the issues of science and technology and the challenges that the continent is experiencing when it comes to science and technology. And we're trying to dig deeper if Africa is actually backward in terms of technology and science, or if something has happened that shouldn't have happened, or something that has happened that should have happened, that has put us at a stage where we are in terms of science and technology on this continent of Africa. But before we come to that, as usual, we go through our a review of the week and how it has been and what we have witnessed, especially on the African continent. And to do that, today I will start with Sister Rachel Takali to take us through how she has seen it through the lenses of the Pan-African way. Sister Takali.
I think for me, my area of interest has been the spirited efforts by the East African community leadership to actually establish a central bank of East Africa. And they envision that that will come to pass this very year. And of course, that is very much at the heart of bringing to pass the concept of economic unity. It has been long in coming, and they deserve kudos for having brought us this far. But further afield, of course, on the global scene at this time in economic terms is the World Economic Forum underway in Switzerland, and that forum purports to actually collect the best brains in terms of economic value and strategy concerning exactly where we are as a world and where we hope to be, and so on and so forth. And I'm thinking that for me, it's painful as a Pan-African on account of the fact that we are grossly underrepresented there. I think from their point of view, we really do not represent much at this present time. They are hoping that we will do something about our own selves, but that is where we find ourselves, not very consequential as a continent at this time.
Yes, Ndugu Rugarama.
Good morning to you, comrades, from wherever you may be watching us from, and good morning, dear fellow panelists here with us in the studio. The week, I noticed the following. One, we have had our young boys, the young men who are doing the domestic football. They play from the country. They are participating in what would be the seniors now, if there was a CHAN like we had not long ago. And Uganda has been doing very well, although they have one match getting through the groups, but there was a draw, then there was a win, and they are in a very tight group. And I think our minister, my brother now, Peter Ogwang, and Micho, but I think Mayanja, to be specific, they are doing a good job. Although I would encourage them to also do a lot of attacking football because they are very defensive. But still, we are getting results, and that is very encouraging, and I'm optimistic that next match we shall also win that one. Two, we lost our cadre, the NRM people, lost the cadre, Dr. Garuwango, who used to be a director finance here at NRM. And death, even if you don't subscribe to the NRM political party, is death. Nobody wishes death to anybody, really. So from that perspective, I think we, as a country, we lost, and as Africa, we lost that great brain and a great worker, a person who loved his country, who has been serving as our ambassador in Kenya. And that one was also very tragic. My
Sure.
condolences to the immediate family, the NRM party, and the country at large. And finally, today in history is when we had the JF Kennedy inaugurated as the youngest president of America, and Catholic at that, if that makes sense anyway. Then
It does so much, especially in the context of
at the same time, coincidentally, it is the same day that back in history we had the Kamala Harris inaugurated as the first female vice president, with her boss as the oldest president of America.
That is true. But now, letting alone the oldest president of America, there is this issue also of your football. I told you I'm not a football fan, but sometimes when Uganda is playing, definitely I take interest. Now, you have this issue of, we were chatting last time and someone was saying, I think they were playing against Senegal, said the boys have secured a goal and we need to pray. Then I'm like, where do you pray? Tell them to pray. So I think we should also go away from...
You know their troubled history.
You guys about mathematics. If someone beats the other one, then maybe we can go through. I think a time has to come that our football has to be scientific. That we should know when we are going and whether we are winning or not.
We don't subject it to prayer.
Yeah, prayer
I think, Comrade Mututa, the bottom line here is that as a country, we are growing in sports.
That's
and
true.
Probably one can argue, those who go back to history, that during the time of Amin as the president, he loved sports, and therefore sports as a country who are a great sports country. But I think, to be fair to history again, under this regime, there is a lot that the country has tried to do, and I think the results are showing in athletics and other sports,
Okay.
a different sphere. So the prayers will always be everywhere. If mother goes into labor, we say, we have taken her to the best hospital, but we have to pray, you know. But I hope that is the sense in which they are saying it, not that we subject everything to. God will get tired. He has a lot to do.
We'll never get tired, of course. And again, for me, one of the things that captured my mind, I think, was a lot, like you said, we were at the burial of Comrade Garuwango in Mbale, And of course, it was massive. Many people who have been touched by Galiwango were there. Of course, the people of the party were there, the local administration of the various districts, because Galiwango had cut across all the Mbale sub-region and beyond. We also had people who came from Kenya, both at the mission but also his friends. So I think we had a big number of people who took part in the burial of Galiwango. There is the other story of, if it's true actually, that where the first son stole a jet.
Guinea.
I'm not talking about the first son of Uganda, we're talking about Guinea. That first son who one point was a minister for youth and sports, and of course his other brother is the vice president, and the president is the father. Now, that is already problematic enough, but not even looking at that, this guy goes ahead to sell off airline jet. Yeah, because I think he's also in charge of the airline department. But that, like we were saying here last time, I think that Africa has a problem. The problems of Africa, much as we blame the West, we blame others, we are also a problem. The idiots with which we do our work, the sluggishness, the lack of respect and responsibility is also a big problem on the part of Africa. So I think it's also something that Africans need to look up. When you have a night dancer in the neighborhood, then you don't give him chance to do his job, even when you know that he will do it anyway. But you should also try to be sensitive. So I think these are some of the things that we have gone through in the week. Now, back to our topic today, and of course my name is James Mututa, who will be coordinating this program as usual. Now, issues of technology on this continent. Are we, and we believe, not only believe, but it's also scientifically proven that Africa was the cradle of technology. So why, if we are the ones who are the cradle of not only technology but civilization rather, why has happened that we have pushed ourselves 3-4 steps behind at the time when we can be going ahead and also take our position at the table of men? And before we come to that, I think we shall hear something from our guest today, and that is Ndugu Cheyune. Through the week, how has been your week?
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator Mututa.
That's the name. I'm
very glad to be here to join eminent Ugandans here, and Pan-Africanists at that.
And you are laughing.
Interesting.
Yes, I've been, once in a while I've been watching, especially Nduguru Garama. Impressed me because there are some of the positions, ideological positions, which he has been putting across.
Especially on the idiots.
Because
people are talking about idiots.
Which I tend to share.
Sure.
Some of them, especially on Africa, yet generally. Its current position, its history, and where I would wish to push this continent, this unfortunate continent.
Sure. I think it's not an unfortunate continent. The continent is fortunate. The continent is very fortunate. But like we were talking last time here, that when you have a beautiful girl, many things happen in the village. Not to cut your point short.
Okay. Okay, you know, even in Uganda there is a saying that when you have grown a castor oil, you know castor oil,
yeah,
the other tree, You don't complain when the doves keep coming.
Sure.
I think that's the line
Exactly.
you are trying to push. But a few things have attracted my attention, but beginning from here, the graduation at the highest military college in Uganda, the National Defense College. Just this week, His Excellency the President officiated in Njeru. At those people who don't know where it is located, the National Defense College is located at Njeru. There is a tendency of mixing up Njeru and Jinja. Njeru is in Uyekwe and it is a municipality. So 18 officers of the UPDF graduated with the masters in the field of security or defense. And to me, that is a very serious and important achievement for this country, for the region, for Africa, because some of the issues that afflict us as the Africans is the weakness in terms of military. Now, the more we get grounded in the military terms, in our defense capacities and capabilities, the better we as a country and a continent shall become.
Sure.
Now, the other one is a conference which has just ended at Munyonyo, the South-South cooperation. You know, and when they talk about South-South, Africa again is in the center of this. And the South is basically to talk about the continent. I use the word unfortunate, and you came to improve it. But the vulnerable continents, that includes Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and of course a few countries in Asia are still in that problem. But these are the areas of the globe that are very unfortunate in the sense that the exploiters, the looters, have targeted them for a long time up to now, and their state of underdevelopment is largely explained in terms of the North. And by the North, I'm talking about the so-called developed world of the USA and Europe. So it was very, very encouraging that a conference was held here. Okay. I remember very well in the 80s, especially when Mwalimu Nyerere was still president of Tanzania. He was one of the key champions of the South-South cooperation. But okay, somehow I think it has tended to backslide. I hope this conference will help it to rekindle its position and synergy in the fight for total and meaningful liberation of this continent, of Africa and the South generally. Oh,
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so viewer, wherever you are, we are getting views on the program that comes to your way from UBC, and this is a Pan-African Friday where we share pertinent issues pertaining the content of Africa and the civilization and the people of this continent of Africa, both in Africa and outside of Africa. Of course, we have many Africans that are away or out of Africa. Now, we are back to the topic of science and technology on the African continent. Are we moving ahead? Are we backsliding? Are we stagnant? Because a lot has happened from the time when Africa was the cradle, the origin of civilization. But what has happened to the extent that we seem now to be following in the steps of others and not able to carry on with our own systems and with our own agenda. And someone defined science as as studying or examining and testing and verifying the facts. So if something is scientific, then it has to be studied, it has to be examined, it has to be verified, and it has to be tested. And when you talk of technology, then we are looking at the evolution that science has gone through, these studies have gone through, and then these experience which are now being put to work. We are studying in science, but in technology, we are now extrapolating what we have started and putting it into practice. So those two concepts put together, where is Africa? And we believe that we are moving ahead, or we are stagnant, or we are moving backwards. Rachel, I will take you on that.
Well, I think this present deficit concerning our technology and science position at the present time, I think was entrenched by the way in which we got our independence, or at the time of our independence. Of course, it was the preoccupation of the white man, and understandably so, to retard every form of knowledge that he found entrenched among our societies when he first made his debut on the African continent, hundreds of years ago in some cases. However, history is rich with examples of that ascertain the fact that Africa indeed had its own approach to science and technology that is attested to in cases such as the very impressive infrastructure left by the pharaohs of old in these robust structures that are called pyramids. Even today, present-day science is hard-pressed to replicate the intricate balances that must have been achieved by the Africans of that era. There are people who forget that the Arabs came much later, but that the peoples of North Africa are basically African. They tried their best to wipe them out, and they've done a good job of that. There are only a few thousand Tuaregs left, and so on and so forth. Then when you go to places in Ethiopia and so on, you also find traces of technological advances. They still have infrastructure there attesting to such things, because you cannot erect a structure that endures for thousands of years without having a firm grasp of mathematics and science. Nearer home, though that is in West Africa, there are of course such things as the Benin bronzes, for example. These are artistic achievements that are even heralded by many in the West as impressive by any measure. What I'm trying to say is that Africans of old knew about science and technology, maybe not as we express it today, but they had, I think the chief transgression of African societies was that many of these things were not written. I don't even know how they transmitted these values. We also know of the robust education centers in Timbuktu, for example, modern-day Mali. Those people were very well learned. There is no one who disputes the fact that these people knew about modern approaches to education and science and so on and so forth. When those societies reached their end, there was a lull there in advancement, because many of these societies range back to the 14th, 15th century and so on and so forth. But going forward, there was not much in the way of innovation. You see, science also goes with innovation. Whenever there is no innovation to succeed the achievements of yesteryears, there will be dead years, if you will. Those dead years, when there was not much in the way of innovation and advancement, were then overshadowed by the colonial experience.
But now, that point, not let go. You talk, especially you're talking about architecture. When you see what was happening in North Africa, when you see what the Great Pyramids, a pyramid that could be built with over 2 million blocks, and these are stone cut
To pinpoint accuracy.
exactly, and you'd also think similar buildings have been excavated in the Zimbabwe Empire and others in many other parts of Africa. Now, where did we go wrong? Because when you look at Egyptians, for example, this mummifying, preserving dead bodies for all this time,
That is science.
yes, which they later on, the Romans picked and also started doing the same when they preserved their popes. Now, this civilization, later on you remember, when you read, they say, now civilization goes to Greece, because Greece is basically not African. And so that, but when finally it failed, they say, no, I think Egypt is not part of Africa. Egypt is part of, looks more towards Europe than Africa, for purposes that you cut out that civilization. But even that one has been proven wrong, because other than Egypt, we have had other parts of Africa where civilization has been traced.
There was
So-
nothing like Egypt. It is called Sudan.
Yeah, the Sudan, exactly.
Means black.
Exactly. So
Okay.
that is why the Sudan issue was diminished, to ensure that it becomes Egypt and more glorified and looks more than Europe than Africa. But even with that, facts are hard to kill. Now, I also believe that even this issue of not having records of African history and African development could have been deliberate, that someone somewhere could have tampered with this history. Because when we look at Egypt, for example, you realize that some of the scrolls that have been found were actually buried with pharaohs. Now, whoever was doing that knew at one point that someone will come to find this evidence, because if it was left anywhere, then it could have been destroyed. Now, I cut your point short to bring the issue of, is this issue of not having documented history a part of the ploy, or is it because Africans were not able to read and write?
I think somewhere along the way, of course, the Egyptians, they talk about hieroglyphics. The Egyptians had their own
System, yes.
their own language and their own record keeping. But I think for the rest of Africa, there is no evidence that we had an alphabet, for example. And I think that must have been one of the principal reasons why that progression failed us. I think where the cycle of these informed generations passed, I think that oral communication, I think it completed its course.
And you're
there
right.
was no connection
Sure.
between the great achievements of the Egyptians and the people of Mozambique, the people of Zimbabwe, and the people of West Africa, and the people of Ethiopia. I think there was no logical transition.
Sure.
And in that malaise, if you will, the colonialists come and work to kill it all. Whatever was left was definitely buried during the colonial era. And even when we took over, we're talking about the 50s and 60s in particular, when most of us took over as our own governors of our political entities. Still, that culture of making sure that what we know is actually transmitted to others and is actually replicated is yet to take root. Consider the fact that, of course, the liberation struggles were consumed with consolidating power.
Sure.
They were consumed with setting the foundation for the modern state. Unfortunately, science, technology, and innovation fell by the wayside. So much so that, as far as I know, the Organization of African Unity, of course the predecessor of the present AU, which was founded in '63,
Yes.
only meaningfully began to address this using the Lagos Plan of Action in 1980. And there, they charged African governments to at least set aside 1% of GDP for science, technology, and innovation. But I have to tell you, Mr. Mututa, that has not
To
come to
date,
pass.
yes.
Even when the successor AU took over in Durban in South Africa in 2002, there still has been a struggle to achieve that traction, to
So-
move us forward meaningfully on the front of meaningful science, technology,
Exactly.
innovation.
Now the problem comes in. Are we looking at that as someone's problem or our own problem?
Our own, of course. Because our priorities are warped.
Exactly.
Because the modern state sits squarely, aside from governance issues, of course, aside from politics, the modern state sits squarely on how far you can move in terms of science, technology, and innovation. After all the sectors rotate around that, even if it be politics.
Exactly.
You're talking about e-governance and so on.
So-
So there, we are stuck.
Ndugu Garama, do you suggest that part of this problem is still not our capacity to have and hold? In other words, to have this information, but also hold it and pass it in terms of documentation. Do you think that's a big problem in Africa?
To start with, Comrade Mtuta, the true history here is that science and innovation are simply components of education. And we all know that Africa was well blessed with her own teachers, her own mode of education, and the content was rich. Sister Rachel talked about present-day Mali. When you go through the books of senior comrades, such as Dr. Clark and also Dr. Chike Ant Diop,
Yes.
the most respected, in my opinion, writer about the African history, who is not biased, very composed, highly informed, and with high levels of clarity about our history. You will discover that places like the very first university, arguably probably on the African or global, at the global level, was the University of Timbuktu. And in that particular university, there are a number of writings ranging from religion, geography, biology, among others. That information is available and it has been archived. What happened is that the unfortunate part that happened is that when colonialism fell onto us, a lot of our literature was taken to the countries that were, I hope you will just permit me a little time to explain this, was taken and can be found littered in the great museums in Europe, Belgium, Italy, Britain, all these colonial, France. We have got our beautiful literature there. History also has it, that among the people who were taken, I hate to call them slaves. I have heard some of my colleagues say the slaves that were taken out of, there's nothing like a slave that was taken out of. These were able human beings with intelligence who were unfortunate that history didn't bless them very well. The resistance was broken and they were forcefully taken to other parts. So there were Africans who were taken into slavery, not slaves taken into other parts of the world. So
Yeah, because the argument also comes in that we ourselves were selling, trading with our people.
there
Because
is
that's
no
also-
society that will not have fools. African society
It's not short
had
of-
some of the fools like we had fools in Europe, in America, because you cannot claim to be clever and you go and kill natives in
exactly.
America and you claim for you are not a fool. So fools are everywhere. It is not a preserve of a given society. Now, having settled that, back here, when you realize that, and my sister also talked about it here, that on the African continent, there was cuneiform and hieroglyphics. The fact that we were able to develop our own writing materials where we could write and our own form of writing is testimony enough that we had the innovation, we had the technology to drive our education agenda. It is therefore not true, and it is historically incorrect for any analyst to claim that Africa was lagging behind in terms of, if you may permit me a little bit here, we will go back still in history and discover that the African man at the very early stages was having problems when he was still a gatherer and a hunter. But he discovered how to use tools such as stones. He crafted stones to make knives. Later, he discovered fire. There was no white man. And at that material time, when you go through Clark, the books of a man like Dr. Clark and check Anthony Diop, at around that same time, when we were graduating, Africa was graduating from staying in caves, developing fire, roasting the meat, having, sharpening the equipment, iron ore turning it into spears, the white man was still staying in caves. So as far as the education is concerned, at the point at which Africa was discovering and making very serious inroads in science and technology, the white man was elsewhere. You asked the question, what happened? This is what happened. There will always be mistakes in history. There was a mistake on the African continent that somehow we allowed a situation where foreigners came and we assumed, because they were not of the same color, we assumed, you remember they came persuasively. When you look at some of the films like Shaka Zulu, you will find how they came. The Bible here, but when in actual sense, after they had compromised your thinking ability, your perception of life, then they would have the colonizer. You have to read books like Poor Christoph Bomba and look at how the colonizer came hand in hand with the religious person. So at the end of the day, you realize that our education system, which was organic and progressive, because what is education? Professor Edward Ezeu describes education as a process whereby the challenges of a given society are solved by the accumulated knowledge of that given society, that the environment is subdued and does not challenge that particular society. To that extent, the African man had capacity at all material times through the education, which included your science and innovation, to overcome the challenges of the day. When the colonial person came into the picture, and a number of factors such as religion, the mode of education changed, the interests, the agenda, we went the 4 steps backwards instead of moving in front. And that's probably where we should start our argument to say, okay, at the particular time of 1963, which Comrade Rachel talked about, we know at that time and subsequently a little bit later that the colonial agenda had set in. The beautiful writings of a man like Dr. Kwame Nkrumah were all done away with. There are a number of, and if you want to prove what I'm telling you, the archaeological discoveries that are being from the Old Vai Gorge and other places attest to the fact that there were a number of innovations, science that was being manifested by those Africans that lived the millions of years backwards.
Yes.
Therefore, I want to conclude here by saying that had our science and innovation, education as a whole, trajectory not been rudely interfered with the colonial agenda, Africa would be at a different level altogether. Nevertheless, now that we have come back through African Union, and which was traced back through the Organization of African Unity, now the African Union. Their departments or directorates like the science and innovation, and it is given high respect. The unfortunate bit is we must interrogate. Even when we have those beautiful directorates, even when we have beautiful universities and we claim they are fantastic, Makerere, where, who funds research and innovation? There, that is the problem. What is the content and how do we deliver the content to the learners? So when you take stock, you realize that we are moving backwards simply because of the interference, and this time around, not like it was during colonial time, but in a manner of sponsorship policy that is actually not ours. We have to address that.
Yeah, because you raise an issue which is very important, so cardinal to the African community and the African people, the issue of education. Because if we're talking about science and technology today, we are talking of the technology that we are copying from the rest of the world. We are talking about things that we are learning from other people. But did we have something of our own to begin with, to learn with? And I think at one point we shall have a clip later on in the program showing how Africans could even perform very complicated operations.
Including this cesarean.
Yes.
The very first cesarean section was done by the Africans.
Yeah, exactly.
Even when you go to these other jurisprudences in America, there are a number of discoveries, science and innovation that took place that was engineered by Africans, the difference being that they were not on the African continent. But they will not say it.
Yeah. So when you look at these operations that were carried out, if someone could be operated, still survive. In fact, in that clip, the gentleman is saying that when Europe, for example, specifically England, tried to do cesarean, they had zero survival of the people they operated on. But when they learned from Africa that still you can operate a woman, get a baby, and have both the baby and the mother safe, it was a revolution in that type of science. But again, when you look at the pyramids in Egypt, for example, they will tell you that the Egyptians put the pyramid to the extent that when the sun would stand on the other time of the year, when the sun will be on the head, on the top of the pyramid, then there will be a communication. That will mean that something has to happen. This is the time of the year. This is supposed to be. So Africans, in terms of science and technology, had moved on. It is not that we as Africans were stupid, but I think that interference, like you said, happened. But do we have now remedies to that can address that? But again, the issue of education, which education are we being fed in? Because the education has to answer the challenges that we are having as a community. Mm-hmm. But you are looking at a system which is consuming a lot of the education and the technology that we are copying from the rest of the world. May work for us, but sometimes may not work for us because the conditions under which we are living may be different from the rest of the world. If people are struggling to see how to have their homes to have heat during winter, maybe it's not a priority to us. If people are surviving to see how they can survive now, yes, they was told that in this war of Ukraine and Russia, now the determining factor is the weather, because some places the snow is so heavy that even heavy equipment cannot move. So maybe that's not our problem. But
the war is between Russia and America plus all the cousins, not Ukraine. Ukraine is
Well, that's a
There was 32
discussion
at
for
last
another
count.
story, for another day. But for now, we're saying that actually even the war between Ukraine and Russia or wherever may not be our priority today. But where is our science heading us? Because when talk even at our warfare, how were our armies organized, especially in Africa? And you can learn from the kingdoms that existed, the kingdom of Congo, the kingdom of the Abachwezi, the kingdom of the Zimbabwe, the kingdom of the Mali, the Ghana. You will have a lot of history about how the African armies were organized, including the women armies. You remember the Ashanti, yes,
Asante
group.
Kingdom.
So, Bwana Cheyune, is this a default on the African people, or is it something that we have not been able to work with, given that we have taken on the education which is not ours?
Yeah, I want to start from the general question you posed at the very onset, that we are the cradle of civilization, therefore science and technology. Then what has happened to the African continent? Or why are we where we are? I want to add on the issue of credulity that Africa is the cradle of mankind.
Yes.
Far from the stories we hear that the first man called Adam lived somewhere outside Africa.
That is the fact, Ndugu Cheyune, and I will simply just complement your point by saying even is it this archaeological discovery points that the cradle of mankind is Africa.
Yeah.
Maybe then the Garden of Eden is here.
There you go.
But in fact, this is what I've been telling people. When you even talk of Adam and Eve, we are in the scriptures we have read from the Bible, including the Quran. We have never heard that Jesus or God has walked in the streets of London or the streets of New York. But we have had a lot of places that are connected to Africa. So no wonder that even God could be an African.
Well,
He is.
okay, that's another interesting matter. But my direct response to the question you posed, we are where we are because we have refused or we have failed to rebel.
Yes.
The condition that was imposed on us as Africans and continues to be imposed on us requires determined rebellion, a total rejection,
A resistance.
a radical resistance, and rejection of the status quo.
Yes.
Why? The colonialism that my colleagues have made reference to, and therefore the neo-colonialism that came later and continues to pervade us, is a very serious matter. It points to one fact, that whereas we could have decolonized our continent in terms of territory, and maybe territory, of course, applies to offices being occupied by us Africans instead of the Europeans. The African mind has not been effectively decolonized. And that is where the center of the problem is.
Sure.
We are what we are because of our thinking. That when the foreigners came, actually they interfered. The technology, the science that was developing, the references that have been cited by my colleagues, including yourself, are enough, but I can even add, here in Buganda, charity starts from home. In Buganda here, is it the European who taught the Baganda to make canoes to move on the lake?
No.
No. Even the organizations of the armies, the Bachwezi you are talking about, the Baganda and so Bunyoro, fierce battles that they were fought against the Europeans in Zimbabwe or everywhere. Now, once we accepted and subjected ourselves to a subordinate position perpetually, the African to the Europeans or the foreigners, then we got it wrong, and that explains the current situation that is disturbing us, the Africans. When you talk about science and technology, you have to ask the questions: which science, which technology, whose science, whose technology, and therefore whose education, which education. Chango Macho, the greatest African, the great, may his soul rest in peace. Chango Macho, the greatest Ugandan I've met in terms of philosophical dispositions, points out at one point that the so-called education that the Africans were subjected to and continue to enjoy and be proud about was not meant to develop the Africans, to help the Africans to develop, but it was instead meant to perpetuate the development of underdevelopment in Africa.
But we're talking about 60 years later on.
Oh yes, and I have said the fact that we refused or failed to rebel. Look at the National Curriculum Development Center in Uganda. How many inches, how many steps has it moved from the colonial education? Even when we say we want meaningful and relevant education, first of all, they invite the foreigners as experts.
Yeah,
they apply for funds from outside Uganda. Now, those ones come to push their interests forward. And therefore, the National Curriculum Development Center remains stagnant in one place. And then, and let me tell you, Comrade Rugarama knows this, and I think all of us here, that the NRM was supposed to be a revolution.
And what happened?
Now, in this case, they preached very well that education in Africa, in Uganda, was not the correct form of education. Along the way, it was hijacked. What was promised?
The funders.
Yes, what was promised in 1986 in terms of changing the education system has not come to pass.
This is one of the biggest problems of Africa. And you have a lot of evidence to that. It's not only the NRM that could have ended up a victim of its own championship. But we saw even in Malawi, someone was forced to appoint a vice president, someone, is it a German guy who, in Kenya here, Moi was forced to appoint Dr. Liki, the minister.
He's a Kenyan.
Dr. Rike, the
white
Kenyan. Archaeologist.
Yes, the white archaeologist.
But he's a Kenyan, my fellow panelist. He's a Kenyan.
We would have no problem, but why force?
Why force? Recently, again, Ruto immediately was elected a president. The first policy that he pushed was the introduction of GMOs. Do you think that was a Kenyan position?
No.
Absolutely
not.
So
the biggest problems that we are having in Africa, it's not the people of Africa stupid or idiots as it is said. It is because we are led by people who have been sponsored to be.
It's a crisis, isn't it?
Exactly. So if you are in power and now you say, this is what we used to tell people and this is what we have to tell people, they say, but remember, this money that you used was our money. And you have to do something. If you don't do that, we can have some other person then we'll have to compromise. So how long are we going to have this compromise?
I think that's what as being perfect in terms of the macro policies, and you know that they are actually getting it wrong, because the interests of the World Bank and IMF have always been to make sure that we keep African continent as a source of raw materials.
Exactly.
Any attempt to do otherwise, like what Comrade Gaddafi was trying to do, have an independent agenda, that you create a state called Libya, which is far and beyond the welfare state. That one, they will create a situation in Benghazi, and it will be a civil uprising. That's how they will codename it, and they will remove you by assassination like they did. They have done that. The coups that CIA has managed in cahoots with other cousins of hers on the African continent are countless.
When we come back from the break, we will continue from Ndugu Jayune's point of what happens and what do we do now that we have found ourselves in this kind of situation as Africa. Do we sit and cry until chickens come home, or something will be done? But don't go away. We will be back after this short break. Thank you.
It's Freaky Friday from Airtel. Buy or gift. Buy or give.
Get freaky too! Dial star 149 star 10 hash to load a Freaky Friday bundle for you to enjoy the best offers on voice and data.
To buy a bundle for friends and family, dial star 149 star 10 star 5 hash. Freaky Friday with Airtel. Buy or gift a bundle today. Dial star 149 star 10 hash to get started. Airtel, the smartphone network.
Happiness comes to us in many places. It's in knowing the mosquito net keeps our children healthy. The wife having the support of her husband. It's in deciding together when to have a baby. And for some, focusing on what's important right now. So what's your happiness? Make the right health decisions to ensure happiness for you and your family.
One-on-one with Michael Jordan Lukomwa.
A weekly face-to-face conversation focusing on accountability, inspiration, information, and sensitization of the public from the various sources, such as inspirational profiles.
Having a disability is not inability.
Professional guidance.
There is no special antiretroviral therapy that is given specifically for discordant couples.
And of course, politics.
Don't you see anywhere that you would give a credit in the fight against COVID?
My role as the owner of the country is not to, be preoccupied by giving credit to my servant.
We have said that if we are to talk to General Museveni, there must be certain conditions in place.
Is it true that you paid 5 million shillings to MPs that voted for Anita Monga and Tayebo?
That is laughable. Why would we pay when we have nominated them as SEC Staffordshire Party has been represented in Uganda's parliament for 10 years. We only by one MP, you yourself and my daughter, Susan.
Every Friday 9 p.m. it's One-on-One with Michael Jordan Lukomwa on UBC TV, inspiring Uganda.
Yeah, welcome back to this episode of Pan-African Friday, a program that comes to you all the way from Nile Avenue here, courtesy of UBC, and we are looking at issues that really concern Africa. And we are now saying we are Africa in terms of science and technology is at a predicament. Do we push the African agenda that we are able to move ahead with what we had started as Africans and things that really concern us as Africans, or we have to abandon this and look at issues that were being fed on by the other civilizations of the world? And when we talk about the other civilizations, we're talking about the other areas that seem or claim or believe that they are more cultured, more civilized, and more developed than Africa. I think which is also debatable anyway, because if we are talking about any civilization, then it has to be super, that even if others were put together, they will not be able to match such a civilization, which as of now anyway doesn't exist. So, Bwanache, we're back to your point. Is it the issue of leadership default? Is it or deficit, or is it the African mentality that we have subjected ourselves to subterranean, to a lower position than we should be?
Basically, it is generally the problem of the African problem, because the conquest of Africa was not a conquest of the leaders alone, but all of us, because even the radical transformations or radical approaches we are suggesting here will have a problem unless the consciousness of the people is improved. But today, like now, this matter, I think it is you who said that maybe God is an African.
He is.
If you presented it to a community of 100 people, they can even stone you. African, Ugandan is here. And if I presented mine, which is worse, mine is worse.
What is yours?
Which says that Africans have their God. There is God made in Africa, God made in Europe. Because I hold the view that God is made, is man-made.
That God is made by man.
Yes.
Of course.
You know the Bible says that in the beginning when God made man.
So then man made God.
But now in the beginning when man made God.
That's a different gospel.
That's a different gospel which will be subject to a discussion.
So if you presented...
Like he has said, the most dangerous position.
Yeah, that's the most dangerous position.
So if you presented it to 10 Ugandans, how many will even listen? They think you are mad. First of all, if you are lucky.
Talking of which, because you have raised that issue, I will also bring in this issue. And maybe one time we'll have time to hear this guy talk himself, Dr. Nyati, like that is a guy from Botswana. He believes that when we are talking about the civilization and technology in Africa, we shouldn't leave out even investigating the issues of now that you call witchcraft. Because if a man is going to stand on a winnowing plate and fly away, we look at it in terms of witchcraft, fine, but can we investigate the energy
Who calls it witchcraft?
that is involved in transporting this person from one point to another point? Of course, Rachel will say, will ask if that happens anyway. I also don't know.
That is science. If the African man, you can be in Mbari, and I'm here, and I'm the African engineer, I'm science now and technology, and your leg is broken, and I carry out my innovation, and your leg gets healed. It's the same thing as somebody sitting down, manufacturing a plane, and it goes into the skies, and it lands in Heathrow.
Actually, according to Dr. Ngathi, he says this issue of wireless was first practiced in Africa, because an African will sit in one place, like you said, those who repair the bones will do that, but there's also one who will say, who sit here and cause you have diarrhea in some other part of the world.
Is that innovation?
At remote.
Yes.
Is that innovation?
No, it is not an innovation, but it's a practice that we have failed.
Therein lies the quarrel.
Yes.
We have with the, some of us have with this craft. Okay, maybe you're saying it is not called witch. Maybe it is called.
Okay,
maybe it is called Uganda craft.
Let's remove the witch.
Okay. Maybe it's Uganda craft.
Let's call it a craft. Let's
and if you're in Zimbabwe, it's Zimbabwe craft. I
yes.
guess. The quarrel I have, the chief quarrel, is why isn't that craft applied in a positive fashion? It is the bad one that we call witch.
This is my response to that. I'm not saying I'm a supporter of witchcraft, but how
you
can
agree that it's negative, right? The craft we are talking
about.
Yes,
of today, because the technology.
No. The one he talked about.
Killing somebody.
No. He talked about causing Ratoro to get diarrhea just because I looked across from him. You know what happens?
Is it any different from the Melinda Gates, who manufacture a virus and send it here and it kills all?
But that is also wickedness. We are talking about if we could just a moment, Mr. Mbuta. If we could use this craft, whether it is Zimbabwe craft or Uganda craft, we said it's not witchcraft. If we could use it to erect buildings, one at a time, per day, in central Kampala, let that happen.
Why
hasn't it happened?
I agree, that is okay, but there will always be, society can never be all positives. There will always be those spillovers, like the negatives. But you see, so bad people must be eliminated somehow. If they cause you diarrhea, you're a bad man, and you,
No, what he's saying, and which also I need to agree, and I think we need scientifically look at this issue. If someone can cause someone elsewhere to have diarrhea without even seeing him, now this craft we are calling it, can we have it done scientifically, in which case it has to be studied, it has to be investigated, it has to be proved,
certified?
Yes, that this can happen. For example, we talked about this thing. This lady who said for her, instead of using the pills that we use for family planning, she can get this woman or girl to be sterile in terms of production until such a time that this girl will be allowed to produce, and she will allow her to produce without using the chemicals that we are using today. Now my thinking is, the other time we were discussing the issue of a person in this part of Hoima where they can make someone to go and dig at night.
Pugangaizi.
Yes. And then tomorrow you realize you have been digging.
Then why don't they create tractors?
No, exactly. That's what I'm saying.
That's my quarrel.
Can we?
Tractors.
No, even if you want to use this as a form of punishment, can we subject some people to this punishment that it can work, but in a more scientific way? Because any technology, if it is left in the hands of people who are not informed, they will misuse it. If you get a gun and give it to a monkey or a chimpanzee, it will shoot at anything that it will find its way. So maybe that's the what. And by the way, this issue of witches and witchcraft is not only African.
No, it is
in
not
the
African.
15th century, you remember what was happening in Europe.
No, today. Have you heard about the Harry Potter series? Well, they're children's books. And they smashed every bestseller list there is. It is glorified, fortified, entrenched, high-level white man witchcraft. Deep. To forget about these Masabos. This is very,
this is
in the heart of
nothing.
Europe. They are powerful witches and wizards.
Can't we subject this craft of Africa to a study that people can be able to study and improve it, so that if it is improved, we will not be able to look around for people's helicopters who can fly on our own, on our wing plates.
You sit on a mat and fly.
Yes, we'll even do our own things without having our own missiles sent to the wrong guys which he wants to eliminate, without necessarily having to buy from America or Russia.
But this is what we're talking about. You see, I'm not taking away anything from Comrade Cheyne. He will come to his point. But let me just state that the African society was organically growing. I told you that right from the start, when Africa was still at the level of gathering and hunting, we started evolving. We were eating the meat raw. Then we discovered fire. And then we started roasting it. We were using stones. Then we sharpened the stones into usable tools. Later on, we discovered iron ore. Then we went into smelting, and we had spears. For heaven's sake, we are not saying, but at the same time, we had the Chwez dynasty. The Chwez dynasty, which is associated with discovery of spears and what have you, which was science and innovation, was at the same time sending moving in the fashion that would amaze any other person. So that blend, that mixture must be allowed to exist. That there are certain bad and there are certain good things in a society. If we bring everything, you have heard this, and this is very dangerous, by the way, that in some of our, with due respect to these religions, which are actually not ours, but we shall kill for them, and we have killed. I wonder that God, whom you must kill for, and he cannot fight his own battles, that because I have talked about your religion, then you must fight to death.
Exactly.
This is what our president and the chairman of the Pan-African, patron of the Pan-African movement, Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, calls ideological bankruptcy. You see, fighting just simply because of that. The truth of the matter is that the African society, which was on a proper historical innovation science development trajectory, was interrupted. We were progressing, we were moving every angle of science and innovation, we were going through it very well. Now, history was unfair to us that we reached a point and we got that disruption, root disruption, which has affected us up to now. We are trying to resurrect, we are trying to get back, but we are finding problems because the areas which we would want to resurrect and perfect, we are not getting them correct, simply because we are still persuaded that the white man has the money that we need, at the same time has the correct content, because Comrade Cheyne here talked about the National Curriculum Development Center. I think it is recently the senior now, the people who are in P, primary, and those who are not in senior 4, they have a new curriculum, which is based on cumulative assessment. I have seen some reports now. Cumulative assessments, you go to the field, then you are not going to be, your future is not going to be determined like it was determined by ours, me, Cheyune Mututa, Takari, where, sorry, the 2.5 hour examination would determine whether you're going to work in a bank, whether you're going to be a lawyer, medical doctor, and what have you. You can imagine that rubbish. So The point here that we are laboring to explain and share with our viewers, without claiming to be the absolute custodians of knowledge, is simple. That Africa certainly is gifted with abundant talent. That arguably left and interfered with, Africa could be possessing the best of the brains. But we recognize the fact that even with the establishment of certain bodies on the African continent, like at the African Union, which deal with science and innovation, we still have certain direct challenges, like the funding, but at the same time also, we have got the colonial master who now has metamorphosized into a neo-colonial agent that has pursued the African person, and they will be taking some of our best brains to these other universities. When they come back, the kind of mind they have, like I said some time back, and I will conclude with it, that our biggest problem, it may not be easily seen with the naked eye, but this is the truth, is not the person that is unable to read and write. No. Our biggest problem is the person who can read and write but thinks wrongly and applies his knowledge wrongly. That is the clarity of the mind. You do not diagnose the problem properly. And like it was said by Kosera in Darkness at Noon, Africa, somehow, we reach points like they were reached in 1963 by Ngwame Nkrumah and the group, where we have diagnosed the problem of Africa with microscopic exactness. But every time we try to apply a healing knife, like Patrice Lumumba tried to apply a healing knife, Kwame Nkrumah tried to apply a healing knife, Bandera tried to apply a healing knife, and other comrades tried to apply a healing knife, a new sower appears.
Bwana Cheyune.
Yes, please.
Do you think that is still a problem?
Yes, and the issues that we have gathered and presented so far can be summarized in one word as a problem: dependency. And the day we got that interruption we have been discussing, and the moment we accepted without rebelling, then it concluded the matter. And that is why we must now, because we are now looking for a way out. We are not accepting the situation to continue. We want to emancipate. We want to emancipate ourselves. We want to emancipate this continent from the looters, the killers. So the President Yoweri Museveni has been preaching about socio-economic transformation. It is not for the sake, it is targeted at what we are questing for here, the total liberation. Because once we produce what we want, once we have our own industries, once we have our centers of science and technology, and once we are masters of our destiny, then we shall have achieved the liberation that we want. That's why the Pan-African philosophy says organize
rather than agonize. Correct.
So what we are doing here, yes, we might sound like we are lamenting, but we are making a point for people to understand, especially the historical perspective, because there are many in our midst, the youth especially, who lack this information that we are deliberating upon. And we are talking about the education system and the so-called educationist. Who is the educationist at this time? When I was studying in the 80s and the 90s, the teachers I met and later the lecturers that I met demonstrated and explained and convinced me how ugly apartheid was, how ugly neocolonialism was, how ugly Zionism was. The youth, the people who are going through these education institutions today seem to be getting prepared to worship these evils. Where they see Israel as, I think where you see they say that God was came from there, that Jesus was born in. Now, even they cannot question whether or not there is a relationship between Zionism or Israel itself and Christianity. Because how many Jews today are Christians?
They are making it worse, Comrade Chai.
Yes.
They are creating Jerusalem. They are creating Jerusalem into another Mecca. Now you have a situation whereby all Christians now are going to Jerusalem and they get certificates. Like Muslims go to Mecca and they are called Hajis. There are titles now that are given to Christians who visit Jerusalem.
And for me, I have no problem with that.
The problem is, one, that land where they are taking is actually not theirs. All they are doing is to make sure that they create a mass, a global mass of those who will support their atrocities, so that an attack on Israel is actually an attack on a holy place.
And exactly, for me, I'm very okay with that. Yes. And why am I okay? Because someone is able to push an agenda and is able to achieve it.
From that angle.
Exactly. Now, the problem of
However
Africa,
unfortunate the agenda may be.
Exactly. The problem with Africa is that we cannot sit down on a round table, whether it is round or not, and we agree that this is what is good for Africa and we need to push it. We can also create our own Mecca if we want. We can also create our own Jerusalem if we want. We can also create a lot of things, because in any case, other than Israel and Mecca, everything is here. So
I think, Ndugu Mututa,
yes,
one of the things that we don't do well as Africans is to really take serious stock of where we are, why we are there, and how we could actually get out of that. Notice I'm not saying as countries, I'm talking about as Africans, because our dilemma is the same. There are people who insist, oh, I'm a Zimbabwean. Well, the last time I checked, your problems were the same as mine.
Exactly.
So we might as well pool our resources. But looking at how dire our situation is, you know, these statistics exist. This data is readily available. How can a continent that has 20% of the land surface, and I'm talking about global land available today, be Africa? And how can a continent that has a very high proportion, at least about 30% of all mineral reserves, and that is Africa?
Exactly.
A continent that has 60% of all arable land on the globe.
65 and above.
At least, be Africa. A continent that has 1.3 billion people, parallel to the populations of India or China.
The freshest of the waters.
How can that continent also be the one that contributes just a very small portion in terms of global trade? About 2% or less.
Exactly.
How can that same continent be the ones, because remember, we're talking about science, technology, and innovation. How can we, with these massive resources, whether they be human, and of course the youngest population anyway. The people of Japan are struggling with too many old people. The people of the Nordic countries are struggling with too many old people.
Germany specifically.
Not that old people is bad, but if they're more than the productive population, there's a problem. So we're saying, how can we, with all these resources, human, material, in other ways, you know, these great stones that are under the earth, how can we also be the very ones that whose footprint is less than 2% in terms of science and innovation? How can we have just less than 0.1% of all patents? are held by Africans or Africa. How can it be?
Actually, even nothing. Why can't we even have the witchcraft as a patent?
Okay. How can it be that just 2% of all scientific innovation is accredited to Africa and Africans? How can it be that research funding is about 0.1% of all funding? And that is where our dilemma, Mr. Rugarama always says, if our contribution to all scientific research is less than 1%, we cannot have an impact in the near future. I was saying, our problem is not sitting down to see what our dilemma is, why it is that way, and how to move forward. If you can't contribute to the scientific research, you can't get results. Even our own investment, you're the one who says we're our own problem. Even the parameters we set for ourselves, when we set the Lagos Plan of Action, to just 1% of GDP per country on African continent. We are not doing that one.
Do we even need that one, someone to come and fund us on that?
No, we set these parameters for ourselves as African Union. We are not doing it. That was 1980. Today, nearly more than 40 years ago, we are not moving.
Africa.
Thank you very much, Madam Takali. The suggestions you are putting across are very pertinent. I want to add that leadership is critical. For us to explain or to define those issues you have raised, that why are we here? How can we get out of here? And also to accept that where we are is not admirable. You need to build minimum consensus across the continent. But that does not happen by miracle. It requires leadership. Leadership that is able to sacrifice. Because if you draw the example of the 60s, the 50s, 60s, where you remember those conferences, All Africa conference in Accra and where? That Africa, that culminated into the formation in 1963 of African OAU, Organization of African Unity. They had leaders, particularly Kwame Nkrumah, who was ready to sacrifice. In fact, he paid dearly. But we are seeing African Union because of Kwame Nkrumah. Now, where is the Nkrumah
of today
for Africa to champion the science, technology, and development?
But again, Bwana Cheyune, when it comes to that, first of all, when we're talking about this leadership, we're not talking about the political leadership only.
No.
Because in terms of science and technology, we need people who are scientifically motivated, but also having the right orientation in terms of ideology. Because in the absence of that, still we'll have very educated people, but still are servants of the agents of someone, like she has been saying. So we need to have a breed of leaders, in both at the top as political leadership, but also in these agencies that are critical to the development of Africa. But like she has observed, how do we get these leaders? Even the research itself is absent. That we are not able as countries to facilitate, to put in place our own research systems that will be able to deliver the results at the end of it. African Union is trying, fine, but how much are we contributing towards that research that we shall be able to attain in terms of science and technology, not only in one area, but across the board, that we, at one point, we shall say, at least as African society, we, in terms of science and technology, we are okay. That's why we're having these ruptures of diseases every other time. Some of them, actually most of them, are sent to us. Not that Africans are so, but that we cannot have a good life, but we are having these diseases, we are having even some of the diseases as the results of the conflicts that we're having. So can we as Africans sit down in one place and agree that science and technology are crucial, but funding of research is also crucial?
But Ndugu Mututa, just maybe 1 minute here. You see, I agree entirely with Comrade Cheyune. Why? The issue of political leadership is very, very, very critical. And we share the same view with our senior comrade Chinua Achebe. Chinua Achebe writing about the problem of Nigeria, which could as well be the problem of Africa.
Like she said.
He says that the problem of Nigeria is leadership. Now, the leadership he was talking about, and of course, I will agree with you that the kind of leadership we need is not just political at an extended level of debate. But let's just concentrate, and I show you that the most important aspect of the leadership is the political leadership. When the politics is right, every other aspect is right. Society must be organized for that particular society to harness her potential across the board. You will get the sports career, you will get the science or education for that matter career when you are politically organized. The leadership, political leadership of any given society gives ripple positive effects to all the other sectors. A society that is politically disorganized cannot get her education correctly. And as a consequence, you are going to have a disarray of development across the board.
You are saying something.
Myself? For me, these are issues that we've circled around for quite a long time. But the last time I was talking on this very matter, I was asking a series of questions. And I was saying, just like Ndugu Rugarama has just pointed out, and of course Ndugu Cheyune here, he was saying where, it goes back to where we started. There was a group of Africans who were very innovative, very cutting edge, back in the 16th century. Then there was a disconnect. Of course, the reasons are not very clear. I don't know whether there was famine that killed all the scientists. Maybe there was COVID. I don't know what happened. It's possible. Maybe it wiped out half the scientists. Or maybe Ebola. But something happened, and even because by the time the white man intervened, there was still a decline in science. He found our science and technology declining. Sure. Because we were no longer at the peak of the Timbuktu era, of the pharaohs. We were no longer there. And this one only completed the trail downward. But what we are saying is, even today, the people who took over with the ideals of Nkrumah, the ideals of Patrice Lumumba, the ideals of the greats of yesteryear, they also lost momentum. They began with these great ideals, and I'm sure science and technology was part of it. They hoped to resuscitate the momentum of years ago. But somewhere along the way, they became preoccupied. And he's talking about political leadership. They became obsessed with power for power's sake.
Yes.
You see, when you get obsessed with power for power's sake, drunk actually, you forget everything else. Everything else becomes, it's accidental. The only thing that you deliberately preserve, deliberately fund, deliberately propagate is power for power's sake. You're not occupying that place so we can become the next internet giant. You know there's a difference. You're not there so we can become the next bread basket. Ukraine, even in the middle of war, is still the bread basket of Europe. Can you imagine? They're still exporting tens of millions of tons of grain. Can you imagine?
Even to Africa.
But he's talking about leadership. Look at what Zelensky is doing. Zelensky was a comedian, and they made all kinds of fun about Zelensky. And I'm not joking. He was a comedian by trade. But this comedian took over power and he became transformed by the idea of the destiny of his people. He forgot, abandoned, totally changed course. He loved this business about self-propulsion. He did the other one for a living. He was a comedian for money. But this one is about the preservation of the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian good, even at the cost of his own life. That is why they can produce despite a war. For us, most societies in Africa are at peace, and we're producing nothing.
And you are selling everything.
We're at peace and going nowhere because there is nobody forceful propagating the agenda of the forefathers of this present African state. When we don't have people who are clear about what we should be doing and why we should be doing it, that's why we're here.
Now, the issue of leadership, of course, this thing comes in every other time you are talking about serious issues, especially Africa. The issue of leadership comes in play. Now, do we have a problem that we can no longer produce men and women who can stand for Africa? Or this issue, because when it comes to elections again, with the process of getting leaders, when we get people who are still being given a bar of soap, a kilo of sugar, a tot of waragi, are we expecting that this thing is going to change anytime soon, Bwana Rugarama?
You take me back. I had one of my supervisors at master's level. I know he's still living. And he read through my initial proposal. Then he tore it in 2 pieces and said, Rugarama, I expect not much more, extremely different from what you have submitted. This is not what I want you to be. You have the potential of being much, much better. He sent me to his private library with a set of references. He's a product of Alberta, University of Alberta, this is Canada, I think. And at the end of that program, I think I was a better person. We need people who will stand and tell us that we expect better, and that we insist to see that this is the kind of results we expected. We are suffering a problem of not having proper advice. The people the few who are left that would be telling the generation that this is where we expect you to take this country. They themselves, in the words of Sister Takari, are consumed with power for
yes.
power's sake.
Yeah.
We no longer have the crop, and I think this is where Comrade Mututa is coming from, that what happened to that crop of leaders, the Patrice Lumumbas, the Kwame Nkrumahs, the Ben Beras, the Soko Toures, the Julius Mwalimu Kambarage Nyereres. What happened to that breed? That breed, the Samora Macheros, what happened to them? They, at the particular time, they existed in history, did their part. Not that we actually fell short of producing other leaders. Because look, we had the late Comrade Magufuli Pombe. He was doing a fantastic job. We had the Kamas in Botswana, fantastic job. You see, but at the end of the day, there is a bigger disease called neocolonial agenda, whose fronters and runners are, they look like you, they breathe like you,
talk like
they have been trained in schools, probably where some of us have not gone.
Exactly.
And their work is to make sure that the system is perpetuated, and they are not going to say it loudly, but they are going to implement the Bretton Woods institutional policies. And if you come in the manner of the Patrice Lumumbas of the then time, like Dr. Pombe Magufuli had come, you don't want loans for your country that are going to be given at exorbitant prices. You are not flying out of your country frequently for purposes of taking a bowl and begging. You are radically different, like senior comrade, may his soul rest in eternal peace, Colonel Gaddafi, and you are putting your country at a certain level, and hence bringing the entire Africa at a level whereby they are going to have their development not dictated upon and shaped by the policies that are cooked in the World Bank and IMF. Then you are going to be isolated, you are going to be branded a dictator, you are going to be eliminated, either directly or indirectly. Going forward, let us not lose hope. The African Union, like majority of the agencies under her, are geared towards making sure that we recapture. The word is recapturing what was taken away from us. There are certain directorates like the Innovation Science at African Union, and they are doing a good job. We have got institutions like the African Development Bank, which are trying to see that we fund some of these projects where we have got a niche. Takari here said that a continent like Africa, putting our natural resources at 30%, I dare say we are well over half of the natural resources of the world here on the African continent. The freshest of the waters here on the African continent. Arable land, well over 65%. How can we be like this? I like that. We must, in the words of senior comrade Rachel Lumumba, again, this time not the Patrice, our own Lumumba here, we must get annoyed to a point where, as Africans, from the Pan-African angle, we say enough is enough, and in the words of Comrade Cheyune, we accept to lose our lives by carrying out a revolution such that the next generation can have a better Africa.
Ndugu Cheyune, are we able to do that if locally here Mutabazi tried to whip people into doing what he thought would be done, and the next thing they denied him votes?
I want to repeat probably what I said earlier, the point of consensus.
But that's also a problem, because having people to agree on something...
Consensus will never be achieved.
It can also be tricky.
Alone.
No, this is what we call minimum consensus, minimum level of consensus.
Okay.
But at 35%?
I don't want to percentage it, but you don't need to, you cannot move alone. You need some consensus. Even all these issues we have been discussing, they need consensus. Just let me give you a simple one. Why are Africans abandoning their food, their own food, for food that is foreign? exotic.
Secretary.
Why?
Junk, moreover.
Because our outlook is continuously being poisoned. And then the leadership, and actually when you say leadership is not about political, because we tend to think, no, leadership at every level. Are you an education institution? What leadership do you give to your children? Because we are what we are because of the leadership that we met at school, starting from nursery, primary, and so on. Now, until we generate and harness that consensus, the way things are seen and understood, even the research you are talking about, is that research independent? Is it decolonized? When people write proposals, what do they have in mind? They have in mind Europe. Until we de-Europeanize that thinking and the writing of proposals and the projects, then we are just wasting time. So what I'm saying, it is very possible. We never lose hope. It is very possible. We are here to drum up consciousness. Actually, this battle will be won if our consciousness is raised and improved in the right direction.
Our consciousness in terms of ideology, in terms of mindset, those are the issues that Africans now need to look at. Rachel?
I am very convinced that even the reason why we're still talking about these sorts of things, given the dire picture that is Africa today,
sure,
is because we live on hope. We know for sure.
Africans are very good at that.
As long as night follows day, there will be a day when a better Africa emerges from the dust.
Amen.
My own observation, my little observation, because of course our lives as humans are very small compared to the history of the planet and so on. But life is in cycles. Nigerians like to say men are in sizes.
Of course, even women.
Okay. No, it meant humans. So we live on hope that this, our cry, will fall on good soil at point T.
Sure.
We don't know whether that will be in our lifetime. We don't know if it will be in the lifetime of our own children. But I know that one day, one time, things will change for the better. They have to. We cannot sink any lower. They have to.
We will have reached the bottom anyway.
It's true. And I think we are there. Considering where we came from, we are really at the bottom. So we can only go up.
So, viewer, thank you so much for being with us, having been with us for all this time. It has been a very interesting discussion, and I think next week will even be more interesting when we look at more of the issues that affect the African people. And you can also see that most of the things, wherever we are living, be them being here in Africa or outside of Africa where you are living, these are some of the experiences that we are going through both away and back at home. And Africans need to have a mindset that will be able to decolonize, to liberate us from our own being. Then we can liberate ourselves from the rest and from the surroundings. So thank you so much for that time. We shall have no better time than now to end, but I know UBC is still coming up with more interesting programs, so please keep in there, don't go away, but have a nice weekend. Thank you so much.